Hello and welcome to another video. Today, I'm taking you back to the 18th century with what is arguably the most central piece of the feminine wardrobe, a set of stays. Essential to any look for the period, these are a comfortable, supportive garment perfect for lounging and for facilitating the most fashionable looks. So let's get into how to make them, and stick around to the end to see a whole outfit come together. A pattern is always the starting point, and for me that was an adapted version of this one from J.P. Ryan. I will always sing the praises of these patterns, as they are not only perfect when replicated exactly, but also make wonderful bases for adaptation. That is precisely what I did here, as I modified this pattern for a mid-century fully boned look, as opposed to a mid-late century half-boned one. As I was cutting each piece, you can see I was careful not to cut the slashes on the tabbed pieces just yet. This was to minimize fraying, which is one of my mortal enemies. After cutting, I got to attaching each piece to its corresponding interlining. As I had used the same fabric for both the outer layer and interlining, this meant I could simply double each piece, creating a mirrored set of two layered pieces, representing left and right sides. Then it was a simple matter to stitch the two layers together with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. For the center back pieces, however, there was a slight difference. Here you can see me folding down the outer edges inward approximately 1/2 inch and then top stitching them in place. Tab time, but not to cut them, merely to mark them. In order to do this, I first marked out the height and width of each tab, and then top stitched with my machine in order to mark them most clearly. Now there are some options in how to attach your boned pieces, but for the way I was going to do it, I had to do boning channels first and seam them together afterwards. So to do this, I first used my machine to top stitch 1/4 inch boning channels on every piece except for the straps. This was a very long process, but, and this is essential to emphasize, far from the most tedious thing one will do in a project like this. Here you can see me alternating between vertical and diagonal boning channels. The shape and direction of the channels is entirely dependent on the time period, your personal preference, and the boning you will use, so do what works for you. I also opted to run a line of stay stitches inside each seam allowance. Again, this is to minimize fraying, as we have established there is little I dislike more than frayed linen. Then I could cut the slashes on my tabbed pieces, and pick out the remaining top stitched markings. This allowed me to add my boning one piece at a time. For boning I used narrow zip ties since they're cheap and readily available, and in my opinion a good imitation of the reed or baleen that would have been used in the 1700s. This was also a very tedious process. Tediousness is most of what you'll do from here on out. With each piece fully boned, I then folded each seam allowance 5/8 of an inch inward and whip stitched it to the wrong side of each piece. This was the final step in readying the pieces to be seamed together. The first seam I completed was the one I did by machine. This was to join the straps to each center front piece, completed with a standard 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and also eventually whipped upwards towards the strap. Then it was time to join each boned piece. If you opted to do the boning channels second, you probably have done this with standard machine seams. But when boning channels are done first, whip stitching is the order of the day. Here you can see me joining each piece with a few million whip stitches done with a doubled thread. I used a contrasting thread to make it easier for me to see, especially since I knew I would later bind the seams and cover the stitching. I actually love doing seams like this, as they are sturdy and there is a certain degree of pride in the fact that the strongest seam you can make is one you did by hand. And here's what everything looked like with all the pieces whipped together. This is so satisfying. Then it was time for the most tedious process of tedious processes, binding. Binding the top and bottom edges is essential, as is binding the seams when they have been whipped together. So for the seam bindings, I first basted down a binding made of faux suede, then folded each piece over its own raw edge and slip stitched it down on either side. It was a similar process to bind the edges. Here I folded the binding over the raw edge, securing it first to the outside. Then, flipping the stays over, I whipped the binding down to the inside. I'm making this sound quick and simple, but hand binding 18th century stays is always time consuming, so I'd recommend binge watching something while you do this. Finally, however, I was done binding. I didn't get complacent, however, as I knew I still had more tediousness ahead of me. Part of this tediousness was the lining. For the lining I used these, admittedly wrinkled, scraps of an off-white linen, cutting 2 of each piece and again leaving the slashes and the tabs temporarily uncut. After this, I seamed each piece together by machine with 5/8 of an inch seam allowances. And here's what that looked like before pressing. And here, the pressed seams signified that the lining was ready to be attached to the stays. This I did by first laying it atop the inside of the stays, wrong sides together. With everything properly lined up, I slashed the tabs, then folded the lining's raw edges inward and slip stitched the lining down. Again, I'm making this sound quick. I can assure you it wasn't. And here's the finished lining, which I think looks very satisfying. This also meant it was time to put in my eyelets. While metal eyelets are fast and easy to set, they were only introduced to corsetry in the 19th century, and so that meant hand-working each one in a spiral-laced pattern. This was simple, but you guessed it, time-consuming process. For this, I used a makeshift awl, a pencil, to create a hole in the linen. The key thing here is that I did not cut or rip any threads, merely stretched a hole between them. Then I used some embroidery floss to create each eyelet. This is my preferred method, but you can use whichever you prefer. And with that, my stays were ready to be laced. After slipping them on and lacing them up, I could tie off the straps and consider them fully done. So why not show you how they're worn? Since a lady would never have worn her stays against her body, you can see me starting with my new shift. My chemise is made of linen, which means it's smooth, cool, and it wrinkles. Oh, how it wrinkles. Since day I filmed the weather was decidedly autumnal, I decided to add an under petticoat. This is pleated at the waist and fastens with tapes, making it simple and easy to put on. Next, I could add my new stays. Getting backlacing stays on without help is not an elegant process, but it is doable. For the sake of my dignity, here's the abridged version. And since I didn't feel like styling my hair, I did what any sensible lady would have done, popped on a cap. And here they are in all their glory, my new stays. I am simply delighted with them, as you can see. But I couldn't stop there. I simply had to show you how these stays would function under a full outfit. Up next was a bum roll, which, as you will see, supports the exaggerated shape of the skirt. And speaking of that skirt, I of course added another petticoat, which adds volume and warmth to the look. I also opted for a fichu. Fichus were styled in many ways and served to provide warmth, modesty, or protection from the sun. I also added some subtle pearls, which I think complement the dress. Speaking of the dress, it's time for the outer petticoat. This is a pink silk taffeta that reminds me of strawberry ice cream and matches the overdress. And here comes that overdress now. This is my robe à l'anglaise, a style with a fitted, pleated back. Mine is open at the front, but some had skirts that closed around the petticoat. This is also a style that allows for hook and eye fastenings, not pins, rarer in the 18th century, but still common enough. And there you have it, an 18th century lady, stays and all. As you can see, stays are essential to create the proper silhouette, making them a staple of any period wardrobe. If you'd like to see more of that wardrobe, including other pieces I've made, both from the 18th century and beyond, please feel free to spend some time on my channel. If you'd like to support me, a like, comment, or subscription never went amiss. But regardless, take care, and I'll see you next time.